Okay, our next reading is a short reading on demand and supply analysis, focusing on consumer demand. Really, it's a reading about utility and indifference curves. Okay, our first LOS is describe utility theory. Now, the idea is utility theory explains consumers' choices or behaviour, in particular by looking at preferences for combinations of goods, based on the satisfaction. So you can think of utility as the satisfaction you gain from consumption of goods, the benefit, the joy, if you like. So our satisfaction is our measurement, or our utility is our measurement of satisfaction. So notice we've got a utility function here, that the total utility a consumer achieves is a function of the quantity of good 1 consumed, plus the quantity of good 2 consumed, quantity of good 3 consumed, onto and up to good m. So in other words, the quantities of different goods that we consume affect our utility. Now notice, quantities must be greater than or equal to 0. Okay, you can't consume negative quantities, that's all we're really saying there. Has to be either 0, you're not consuming anything, or greater than 0. And notice as well that as we get an increase in quantity, if we held everything else constant, then we increase utility. Now the whole idea really essentially is more is preferred to less. Now the basic idea with our utility theory is we've got consumers that are trying to maximize utility given a finite amount of income. So therefore when we're consuming products, we're going to look at the utility per dollar spent. And if the utility per dollar spent on a particular product is higher than the utility per dollar spent on another product, I will consume more and more of the particular product. However, you tend to find that utility diminishes the more of a product or a good that you consume. So we talk about diminishing utility. Notice our utility here is an ordinal measure. Now if you remember ordinal from your quants material, it means that only the order makes sense, not the intervals essentially. So when we're looking at indifference curves, all we'll be able to say is we prefer to be on a higher indifference curve. We can't actually establish by how much. Okay, so that does take us rather neatly to our next learning outcome that asks us to describe indifference curves. Now the basic of an indifference curve is really spelled out in its name, inasmuch that as consumers will be indifferent between bundles of goods that lie on the same curve. And we're going to look at indifference curves for 2 products in a second. Now indifference curves for 2 goods are always going to slope downwards, and the indifference curves are always going to be convex to the origin as well. Higher indifference curves have more utility than lower ones. Okay, but remember it's an ordinal scale. So all we can actually say is we prefer to be on a higher utility curve than a lower utility curve. We can't say that a higher utility curve has twice as much utility as a lower one, or for example, so we can't put a difference. We can't look at the interval between indifference curves, but we can say we would prefer a higher to a lower. Now the slope at any point on an indifference curve is the marginal rate of substitution. The marginal rate of substitution is just going to be the rate at which the consumer is willing to swap goods of X for goods of Y. And of course the final point that we're going to make is our indifference curves may not cross. Okay, let's have a look at an indifference curve. Excuse me. So here are our indifference curves. We've got 2 goods, good Y and good X, and you can see up there, what have we got? Well, you can see that the consumer would be willing to give up 1 unit of Y, so to move from 5 units of Y to 4 units of Y, in order to obtain 1 extra unit of X. Move from 1 unit of X to 2 units of X. But we can see at other points on the indifference curves that's not true. So you can see that the MRS, the marginal rate of substitution, changes along the indifference curve. Notice at the second point, the consumer would be willing to give up 1 unit of Y to obtain a further 3 units of X. Or if you like, they would be willing to sacrifice 3 units of X to obtain 1 unit of Y. Okay, our next LOS is calculate and interpret budget constraints. So what we're going to do is look at a very simple idea, because you can only sketch it really for very simple ideas where there are only 2 products. Problems, once you've got 2 products, then your diagram's no longer 2-dimensional. Okay, now the budget line is going to show all combinations of goods that will exhaust the consumer's income. I think it's easiest to do it rather than really talk about it. So let's imagine that we've got a consumer with an income of $4,000. The price of good X is $80. The price of good Y is $200. So of course what we could do is work out the maximum quantity of X and Y they can consume. Well, by the maximum quantity of X they can consume assumes that they consume no Y. So essentially, if you take your 4,000 and divide it by 80, it would tell you the maximum quantity of good X that could be consumed. Likewise, by taking your $4,000 income and dividing it by $200, the price of good Y, it tells us how much of good Y we could consume in total. So let's do that. So 4,000 divided by 200 gives us 20. If we were to consume no X, we could consume 20 units of Y. Or, of course, other way around, if you take your $4,000 and divide by 80, you get 50. So if we were to consume no Y, we could consume 50 units of X. And we've just drawn a straight line between them representing all of our bundles that would consume all of our income. Now notice we've also got a shaded area called the opportunity set that represents all feasible bundles. Now the idea that we're going to use within our economics is you will always want to consume all of your income. Now, how do we know the bundle that the consumer will actually choose? Well, what we're going to need to do is put the consumer's indifference curve until it reaches a tangent to their budget line. And then that will tell us exactly what they're willing to consume. So you can see in this case, we've decided it's 12 units of product Y and 20 units of product X. Now you can see that I1 is preferred over I0. I0, the indifference curve I0, it's obtainable, but it doesn't consume all of our income, so we're not maximizing our utility. Notice the indifference curve I1 lies above I0, and as we've already said before, more is preferred to than less. We would prefer to be on the highest indifference curve possible to maximize our utility. Indifference curve 1 has more utility than indifference curve 0. Now in which case, indifference curve 2 that we've just drawn on here, surely that is preferred to indifference curve 1 because it's on a higher, it's higher. Well, of course, yes, it has more utility. The problem is it's unobtainable. Why? It would require more than all of our income. Therefore, to work out the consumer's equilibrium bundle, we put on the budget line, we then map the consumer's indifference curves until we get a tangent with the budget line that tells us how much of goods Y and X our consumer will actually consume. Okay, we also need to talk about substitution and income effects, and we're asked to compare. Now the substitution effects says as goods X's price decreases, it will always shift consumption to more of good X. So the substitution effect is simply saying as the price of a good falls, you will consume more of it. Now you can think about consumers making their decisions based on utility per dollar spent. Now of course, if the price of a good falls, then the utility per dollar spent on that good increases. As a result, we will want to consume more. So the substitution effect means that as price comes down, consumers will substitute or consume more of that product. Now the other impact that we have is the income effect, and we've talked about this in the previous reading. Now remember, if the price of a good comes down, it means our consumer is no longer consuming their full income, i.e. the budget line is now going to shift. Now of course, we could then talk about normal goods or inferior goods. If you remember, a normal good is one where if your income increases, consumption of that good increases. Remember what an inferior good though is, as your income increases, the quantity demanded of the good falls. So it could be potential, or we could potentially have a positive substitution effect, but a negative income effect working in the other direction. And in fact, in particular, we need to discuss a Giffen good. A Giffen good essentially is when the negative income effect is greater than the positive substitution effect. In other words, essentially, you've got an inferior good where the income effect is bigger than the substitution effect. What does that mean? Well, as price falls, quantity demanded drops as well. Or if you like, as price rises, quantity demanded rises with a given good. Okay, so we have a rather bizarre situation with the given good. We have an upward sloping demand curve. And the last thing we need to talk about in this reading is a Veblen good. Higher prices increase desirability. So what we're saying essentially is as the price goes up, the status of the good increases, and as a result, people will demand more of it. The idea of it being reassuringly expensive. And of course, this is the case with designer and luxury goods. The higher the price, the more prestige the good has, and as a result, potentially, for some individuals, the greater the demand. So for some, but of course not all individuals, you'll find a positively sloped demand curve. In other words, as the goods price goes up, quantity demanded increases. Now, who are those individuals? Of course, for Veblen goods, they tend to be particularly rich people. Now notice our Veblen goods are not supported by the rules of consumer choice that we've discussed throughout this reading.